shared with our panelists, including the set of questions at the end that they are tasked with answering in the opening presentations. So Platypus is an organization constituted back in 2007. We are interested in political education. We run reading groups as well as coffee breaks, and our main activity are these public discussions. This particular panel has been around in Vienna, in Chicago, and London, so it's an international panel. And we work with chapters at universities specifically, so we gear ourselves towards student political education, but our public panels are open to all. Tonight's event, Neoliberalism and Its Discontents, has changed over the course of us executing the panel, mainly because the election of Donald Trump raised new questions about the crisis of neoliberalism and its potential political expression. So I'm going to read to you the description and a set of questions, and then I'll introduce the panelists. The left has, for over a generation, for more than 40 years, the crisis of 1973, placed its hopes in the Democratic and Labor parties to reverse or slow neoliberal capitalism, the move to transnational trade agreements, the movement of capital and labor, and austerity. The post-2008 crisis of neoliberalism, despite phenomena such as SYRIZA, Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, and anti-austerity protests more generally, Bernie Sanders' candidacy, and Jeremy Corbyn's Labour leadership, has found expression on the avowed right through UKIP, Brexit, and the UK Conservatives' move to red Toryism, and now Donald Trump's election. The old neoliberal consensus is falling apart, and change is palpably in the air. Margaret Thatcher's infamous phrase, "there is no alternative," has been proven wrong. What can the left do to advance the struggle for socialism under such circumstances? In the 1960s, the left faced political and social crises in an era of full employment and economic growth, departing from official communism, which had largely supported the development of the welfare state in industrialized capitalist countries. Many of the left challenged the existing political order of Keynesian Fordism through community organizing on the principle of expanding individual and collective freedom from the state. Against Keynesian economic demands, many of these leftists supported the right's efforts to integrate formerly oppressed identity groups into the corporate professional managerial class. Since the 1970s, the significance of the fact that all these aims were taken up politically by the right in the name of freedom in the form of neoliberalism is still ambiguous today. So the questions that we send our panelists. Why has the left recently supported attempts to politically manage the economic crisis after 2008 against attempts at political change? How can the left struggle for political power with the aim of overcoming capitalism and achieving socialism when the political expression of the crisis of neoliberalism has largely come from the right, for instance, with Trump? So I'm going to introduce our panelists. Closest to me for this, Daniel Lazare is an author of 2 books about the U.S. Constitution, The Frozen Republic and The Velvet Coup, and a third about U.S. urban policy. As a journalist, he has written for a wide range of outlets, from the New Left Review, The Nation, Le Monde Diplomatique, to Jacobin and Consortium News. Topics have included U.S. political structure, terrorism, Eastern Europe, and the Yale historian Timothy Snyder. Next to him is Wayne Price. Wayne Price is a longtime writer and activist in the areas of human rights, union struggles, anti-war organizing, and climate justice. He describes himself as a revolutionary anarchist who is influenced by aspects of Marxism. He writes regularly for The Utopian, Anarcho-Syndicalist Review, and www.anarchismo.net. He has written 3 books, the latest being The Value of Radical Theory, an anarchist introduction to Marxist critique of political economy. Next to him is Michael Kinnucan. Michael is an editor of The Hypocrite Reader and a member of the Democratic Socialist of America. He writes on U.S. politics. And last but not least, Robert Cuffy is a former member of the Trotskyist Lethal Revolutionary Party and still identifies with their political program. He's a current supporter of the Socialist Workers Alliance of Guyana. He's also a former maintainer of the CLR James page at the Marxist Internet Archive. His current goal is the revival of the radical West Indian tradition as embodied most recently by the Guyanese revolutionary Walter Rodney. So the structure for tonight's panel will have about 8 to 10 minutes for the opening remarks. Then we'll have a 3 to 4 minute response where the panelists will respond to one another, and the remaining portion of the event is completely dedicated to the Q&A. So we hope that you will join us with some critical questions at that time. So without any further ado,
the topic before us this evening concerns the failure of the left to reverse or even slow the progress of neoliberal capitalism. It's been more than 40 years since the crisis of 1973, as the program notes inform us, but the left can't make it to first base. So the question is why? Why hasn't BDP begun to rise to the occasion? By way of an answer, let me begin this with a quick recap of actually what happened in 1973. In fact, the crisis began 2 years earlier when Nixon slammed shut the dollar window and ended the convertibility of the greenback into gold. The result was inflation, the 1973 Arab oil embargo, and the deepest recession since 1937. Clearly, some sort of epochal crisis had arrived, just as Marxists predicted. But while they got some things right, they failed to predict the ability of the capitalist class to manage the crisis, control it, and even turn it to their advantage. The result was to artificially prolong capitalism's life and put off the day of reckoning for decade after decade. But there was another consequence as well, to intensify the final crisis when it finally arrived. Intensification in all its glory must be understood as more than a purely quantitative phenomenon. It means not only a bigger financial crisis, but a bigger and qualitatively more advanced environmental crisis, technological crisis, and a political, structural, constitutional crisis as well. Some aspects of this crisis are well known. A deepening economic crisis due to the declining rate of profit has been a topic of discussion on the Marxist left for years. So has the declining physical well-being of the American working class due to obesity, drugs, and other forms of ill health brought on by joblessness and economic stress. The environmental crisis, global warming first and foremost, has certainly been covered quite heavily, despite the fact that Donald Trump refuses to believe it. But other aspects of the crisis have not been covered at all and are, in fact, poorly understood. Technology is one example. To suggest that we are living in the midst of a technological slowdown will strike many people as nonsensical, since everybody knows we live in an age of high tech. But despite laptops and the internet, the fact is that other sectors are falling farther and farther behind. For example, it's been more than a century since the first Model T rolled off the assembly line, yet we're still stuck in an age of mass motorization, even though the costs by now far outweigh the benefits. Travel times are declining due to congestion, while worldwide highway fatalities now stand at a shocking 1.25 million per year. Air pollution due to spiraling levels of traffic have rendered dozens of cities all but uninhabitable, particularly in Asia, while infrastructure costs are rising due to highway construction and suburban sprawl.
Could you speak up, please?
Sure. Yet so decadent has capitalism become that the ruling class has lost sight of any concept of utility. Mired in economic minutiae, it has no sense of what mobility means, why it's desirable, or how best to achieve it. Where the 19th century saw a transportation revolution roughly every 20 or 25 years, the 20th and 21st century has seen a variation on the same consistent theme. The same goes for oil. The age of fossil fuels began in the mid-18th century when water power began giving way to coal. Nearly 3 centuries later, we are still stuck with carbon fuels, even though we are fully capable of moving beyond them via a combination of conservation, wind, solar, hydro, and perhaps nuclear as well. The technologies are waiting in the wings, but political and economic stagnation prevents their implementation. In places like Saudi Arabia, gargantuan oil profits have resulted in a grotesque rentier economy that is stuck in the 7th century and as a result is sending out wave after wave of sectarianism, terrorism, and war. Entire countries have collapsed under the impact, most notably Syria and Yemen. Yet all advanced capitalist nations like the US can do is sell the Saudis more weapons with which to wreak more havoc. Finally, there is my particular specialty, the crisis of the state. The post-war economic recovery and political modernization went hand in hand. In the US, this meant that an antiquated 18th century political structure had to be updated so that education and research could be improved and the most scandalous features of Jim Crow eliminated. In Europe, entire new republics had to be created out of the rubble. Supranational structures such as the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, and NATO were also created so as to bind the international capitalist community together. Last but not least, the 6-member European coal and steel community, forerunner of today's 28-member European Union, emerged in 1951. These state or quasi-state structures were the precondition for factories and markets. But since all emerged during the golden age of post-war capitalism, all were predicated on high economic growth. Once growth began to falter, they faltered as well. The consequences are all around us. The process began with the collapse of the Soviet bloc, then moved on to Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and then the Middle East with the Arab Spring in 2011. By 2016, the rot had begun to penetrate the capitalist core. Brexit was one result, the election of Donald Trump another. Although the EU apparently dodged the bullet with the election of Macron, we can safely assume that turbulence there is merely pausing before ascending to a higher level. But let's stick with the US for a moment. Trump is not just a bad hombre who lucked into the Oval Office, but a walking, talking, tweeting expression of the US constitutional meltdown. He was elected because parties had effectively disintegrated. Not just the parties, moreover, but the very idea of a corrupt and unchangeable duopoly that the repocrats represent. Trump's crude, Mussolini-esque manner suited angry voters who had come to regard bourgeois politicians as nothing but double-talking shysters. Not incorrectly, I might add. Moreover, the fact that he lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million, but still won by virtue of the Electoral College, shows the degree to which Americans are prisoners of a constitutional structure beyond their control. The Constitution says that 2/3 of each House plus 3/4 of the states must give their say-so before changing so much as a comma. This means that 13 states, representing as little as 4.4% of the population, can block any reform sought by the remaining 95.6. It's a recipe for constitutional paralysis that won't end until the 18th century coach in which we are all riding plunges off a cliff. Think about it. The global hegemon, the sole remaining superpower, is the victim of a 230-year-old political structure that is beyond repair. As intelligence agencies maneuver behind the scenes, Democrats cry treason, and Trump surrounds himself with military men so as to ward off any threat to his power. The U.S. is beginning to resemble one of those Latin American republics in which a column of tanks is forever threatening the presidential palace. The U.S. Constitution, in a sense, serves as the legal anchor for the entire post-war political structure. If it goes, therefore, the rest goes with it. The unprecedented unity of the capitalist world has led to an unprecedented crisis of the capitalist state. So when the organizers of this discussion ask why SYRIZA, Occupy Wall Street, and the rest have made so little headway, the answer should be obvious. Their programs, an end to austerity or a redistribution of wealth, make sense as starting points, but they don't begin to grasp the enormity of the problem we face. Their inadequacy is glaring. Capitalism has changed 1,000-fold since 1917. It has expanded and grown infinitely more sophisticated and complex, and it has grown more ambitious as well. Socialists must broaden their thinking merely to keep up. We must grasp capitalism as a whole because the whole of capitalism is in crisis, and it's dragging the entire world down with it.
Our to talk about the problems of the left, since I'm not sure what the left is. And I don't feel myself to be very much part of the left. The left going all the way to social democrats, communists, and so forth, to the groups that regard themselves as revolutionary. I feel that I'm sort of the left, but not in the left. Let me start by thinking about why we have these elections. I'm sure that I don't have to discuss with people who are attending this meeting that the purpose of elections is not for the American people to run the government. Actually, it has two major purposes and a few minor ones. The first and most important one is for different factions of the ruling class to settle their differences and decide on how to go forward in spite of disagreements or different interests without having to shoot it out in the streets or without establishing a dictatorship, both of which were, of course, high overhead. I'll get back to that. The second major point, of course, is to bamboozle the American people, the working class in particular, to believe that they actually run the country. And they have minor advantages. It's a useful method for bringing up talented people from the middle class or lower class or working class to serve the state. Think of the Obama family or the Clinton family. But these are the major purposes. And we've seen, and I agree with the whole analysis laid out here by Daniel Lazare. It seems to be right down, hit the hammer on the hammer hitting the nail on the head. The problem, the system isn't working that well, as we see in the last election. We're having, given the crisis of the economy, the long-term crisis, the return, I would put it, return of the symptoms of the epic of capitalist decay, with the end of the post-war boom from around the 1970s and so forth. Given the situation, the Republicans have been used as the cutting edge of the attack on the working class, to lower the standard of living, to have more, speed up the imperialism around the world. They're not the only part of the blade. The Democrats are also part of the blade, but the Republicans are the cutting edge. And to do this, they've had to whip up a base to nihilistic hysteria based on all sorts of issues involving, have nothing to do with reality, involving abortion, sexuality in various ways, race, immigration, and so forth. This is different from the Democrats, who historically base themselves on minorities and on, so-called, and on the working class. Now, there's a problem always with the Democrats, has always been, you read all the essays in the Nation or elsewhere, saying, why can't the Democrats show spine? Why can't they fight? Unlike those Republicans who are so strong and fighting for their reactionary point of view. Well, the problem was you could whip up middle class, lower middle class, and upper working class people to fight for bizarre things that were out of reality, and that was safe for the system in general. Whereas to whip up the working class to fight against the capitalists, against the rich and powerful, that was very dangerous. So the Democrats really couldn't go too far with that, and in fact they have finally gotten to a point where they have quite consciously, literally, written off the mass of working class people in this country. If you read Thomas Frank's book, Listen Liberal, he goes through the evidence that the leaders of the Democratic Party, going back to, especially around the time of first Clinton, Mr. Clinton was deliberately said to write off the unions, labor, and so forth, and put their interest all on so-called professional middle-class people. And he worried, when he wrote this book, that this might cause them problems electorally, which, of course, as we know, it did. That's the perspective. The problem with the Republicans, though, having whipped up this base to a crazed extent, is that the base wanted something in return. They believed this stuff, which is unfortunate for, it's tough being a con man if you actually persuade someone to actually believe what you're selling to them. And then you've got to give them what you have sold to them even though there was nothing to it. The famous example being the first President Bush, who swore and got support by saying, I will never raise taxes. If they come and say, raise taxes, I'll say, read my lips. And in fact, then he did raise taxes. And to his surprise, and surprise those around him, a mass of ordinary Republicans had actually believed his promise and were shocked. Who would have thought? So what happened to this enraged mass of Republican base ended up supporting somebody who was the least competent person to be a president among Republicans, and in fact among almost anybody in the past 100 years. So much so the joke being people saying, gee, think about the good old days of the George W. Given this, so it results in a crisis. And at the same time, it gives a crisis of illegitimacy, of people saying, who is this guy, elected due to this the archaic kind of minority vote, but the archaic electoral college put him in, plus voter suppression laws done by the Republicans against mostly black people, people of color, plus the finagling by the FBI and by the Russians and so forth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, a lot of the annoyance about the Russians is very hypocritical, considering the amount that the United States has intervened in other countries, their elections and overthrown governments and so forth and so forth. So, as a result of all that, we have a government that is extremely unstable and has roused up. On the one hand, you have the people who supported Trump and who have a promise been made to them, better jobs in particular, more above everything, all else, which they are not going to get. And on the other hand, the people who had voted for Hillary, or the people who did vote for Hillary, but just are shocked at somebody like Trump being put in, there's an enormous wave of opposition, of hostility, of rebellion that has swept across the country. And we've all followed that. This is a very healthy thing. At the same time, what it says something about the biggest weakness of it, as everybody I think in this room would agree, is the lack of a left. The overall perspective of this movement, so for which has been in an exaggerated way called the resistance, as though we were the French resistance fighting against the Nazi occupation. Even Hillary Clinton said she's not part of the resistance. The problem with this is entirely and very deliberately being directed into a pro-democratic party, pro-electoral, pro-liberal strategy. And people have generally been following this. And it's had certain advantages. Certainly the, at least original defeat of the attempt to get rid of even the moderate benefits of the Obamacare, the defeat of that attempt was due to mass upheaval. We know that the attempts to keep out, to stop immigration, the Muslim ban, besides the electoral, the legal aspect, was also largely countered by the mass demonstrations again. And that's all true, and I think it's very important, and not for us to simply give up, as though, well, Trump got elected, we might as well shoot ourselves. On the other hand, this limitation drives everything to the right and to the idea that, well, if we only hadn't elected Trump, if only we had elected Hillary, everything would have been so much better. Well, Hillary can talk the talk and make things look better, but in fact, as I said, the Republicans are the blade, the sharp edge, but the Democrats are also part of the blade, part of the attackers. And in particular, the weakness in the left, in particular against the whole movement, is the lack of the lack of labor and the involvement of labor. Let me conclude then by saying the main task, I think, of the left, or those who are radicalized, those who are fed up with the current system and aren't fooled by the illusions of the Democrats and the liberals, is to look to build a left wing of this mass current movement, a wing that is non-electoral, non-parliamentary, not pro-capitalist, but which aims to build something that's really in opposition. That as the movement reaches its limits and finds themselves betrayed by the Democrats, will be able to build something that is hard, not something that's going to immediately sweep everybody into its side, but can build at least a left wing that is prepared to fight and fight all the way.
Thank you.
All right. So we've been invited to speak about the left's response to the crisis of neoliberalism. My question, I suppose, is what crisis? I think when leftists use the word crisis, there's a bit of false optimism. Crisis means a moment of decision in which neoliberalism might find itself transformed, but I look across the sort of Western European and American political sphere and I don't see any such challenge. To describe, for instance, Trump as evidence of a crisis of neoliberalism, Trump was elected with the same electoral coalition as many previous Republican candidates, and now he's pursuing much the same policies, the policies that have been the Republican coalition's guiding lights for decades. I would see Trump's election less as a challenge to neoliberalism and more as analogous to Macron's recent election, a sort of new branding strategy for the same neoliberal policies. You know, I hope I live to see a crisis in neoliberalism. And really the question for me is why there is no crisis to manage. And what I'd like to talk about is what does seem at least slightly new in American politics and to a lesser extent in European politics, which is this sort of new socialist or allegedly socialist, or using the word socialist movement in America around the Sanders campaign. And I'd like to talk about the historical imaginary of that movement and how that historical imaginary limits it and how it might change to become, you know, a political force capable of producing a crisis in neoliberalism. So the sort of popular periodization that emerged a little bit around Occupy Wall Street, it attained sort of mass scale there, understands neoliberalism to mean a new historical era that started in the mid-70s, in which something like social democracy was lost and something closer to a libertarian capitalism began to emerge, a capitalism without borders, a deregulating capitalism, a capitalism without unions. I think that periodization certainly has its value, but the image it produces is of a sort of a social democracy that lives elsewhere, a social democracy of America before 1975, or a social democracy in Europe. And that roughly is what describing oneself as a democratic socialist means for Sanders or for Sanders supporters, people like that. And I think to understand better this movement, one has to look back to the origins of social democracy and understand that social democracy understood itself as a sort of in the early part of the 20th century, understood itself as a gradual and electoral road to socialism. As part of a process of gradually building worker power that ended someday, not soon, but someday, in genuine economic democracy and worker control of the economy. That did not come to pass, and it was not constructed, nor was there even a real attempt to construct it in the post-war welfare state as it emerged in the US out of the New Deal and in Western Europe out of the rubble. That situation, Fordist Keynesianism, is better understood as the blocking of social democracy in the earlier sense. A deal made between labor and capital, a way capital headed off the challenge of rising labor movements, essentially by offering the workers a deal where to the extent that they gave up the demand for economic power, they would get paid more, and they would have, social insurance and unemployment benefits and more money, which are wonderful things to have, but at the price of the Labor Party's becoming engaged in the project of maintaining capitalism. So democratic socialism to which Sanders and Sanders supporters look back in the golden age of capital is much better understood as welfare capitalism, as the attempt to use the wonderful value-creating power of the markets to then redistribute post-market in order to make an equitable society. And I think a lot of things change around 1975, but I do not think that there is a fundamental shift in that situation after 1975. I think the periodization that says there's a new era that begins in 1975 is false. And I think that for a few reasons. One of them is that the major social programs which were established in the post-war period have not been rolled back anywhere. There's been pushing around the edges, but fundamentally, every state in Europe still has universal health care. We still have old age pensions and unemployment benefits, and so it would be a mistake to understand us as having certainly gone back to a pre-war situation, but even to have entered a period where capitalism, where the settlement between labor and capital looks that different. What happened was not a change in direction where the gains began to. What happened was not a change in direction, but sort of an inflection point where further gains stopped, where rising standards of living no longer happened, and that is not a problem, certainly, for the kind of capitalism we have now materially. It can very well afford to never pay workers more, but it is a problem ideologically. The deal that headed off social democracy and brought us to welfare capitalism relied on continually improving living standards, and the capitalism we have now can no longer deliver. As I see it, there's this concept. There's this concept that floats around that Adolf Reed introduced, the left wing of neoliberalism, which the idea is sort of that you get various kinds of racial equality and gender equality, but don't get further worker power. There's another term that sounds just like it that I'm more interested in, which is left neoliberalism, which I think is in some sense the dominant ideology of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party right now, which says left neoliberalism says the market works, we don't need regulation, we don't need unions, but what we do need is massive aftermarket downward wealth redistribution. So left neoliberalism believes essentially that you can produce universal well-being within a society without increasing worker power within that society. So I see that as one side, the leftmost side of mass politics in the US today. And then on the other hand, there's the more radical Republican Party thing, which just in the last decade has begun to genuinely fantasize about rolling back social welfare programs on a sort of mass scale. but which seems actually very unlikely to be able to accomplish that. You know, they've been fantasizing about privatizing Social Security, but those programs have very deep social backing. So we're in this kind of stasis or deadlock where, on the one hand, welfare capitalism can no longer produce expanding well-being or rising wages, and on the other hand, there is even the left understands a certain responsibility to maintain capitalist production and not to scare the capitalists as sort of the necessary condition of, for instance, anti-poverty programs, or for instance, universal health care. So, so we find ourselves in this deadlock, and both parties continue to promise rising living standards, you know, expanded welfare, and neither can actually deliver it. One minute. Okay, got it. And so from this perspective, what Trump looks like is someone who is, unlike the rest of the ruling class, does not understand that one can no longer deliver rising real wages, and is therefore much better at lying about it. That's sort of his comparative advantage, and that's why he rises at this moment. Or he's not lying. He genuinely thinks the job will come back. And on the other side, we have the Sanders coalition, which wants to go back to the 50s and 60s, or rather to the future that the 50s and 60s seemed to promise of ever expanded social welfare programs, but has not yet understood why the future of the 50s and 60s is not some possible, Sweden, but rather the future we live in today, and therefore will not be capable of delivering on its promises.
Thank you. And Robert?
Great. Thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I think a big challenge in these presentations about things like neoliberalism is finding a cogent definition and analysis of neoliberalism. And I don't know how many people walked into the room with a confident understanding of what they consider to be neoliberalism, but it took me back a little bit to see that different people see different things in neoliberalism. So I would say, for example, that one major example of a neoliberal act, for example, would be in response to the 2008 crisis when the US government bailed out the banks and the auto industry, right? Clearly that working people were left behind, were left to suffer, the homeowners and the auto workers. So if this response then to an economic crisis is neoliberalism, then I think there needs to be some kind of a focus on the economic crisis itself, and you have to give it a name. Where is this thing coming from? And I'd like to say the name, and I'll say it several times throughout this presentation, it's capitalism. Capitalism is a problem. These contradictions we see now, the problems, the crises cannot be resolved under a capitalist system. The problem with capitalism is, of course, its crisis of profitability. And we see this crisis rearing its head. We can look at America for the historical example over time, right? So prior to the World War, America was in economic depression, and the government tried everything they could to fix it. The New Deal came about, right? Roosevelt went to the major industrialists and he said, listen, I'm going to save you from yourselves. Let me implement these programs where we give these gains to the workers so they don't destroy the country, because we're already in the midst of an economic crisis. The New Deal did not solve the crisis. What did was World War II, and the fact that the US was able to then reorganize the world with itself on top and able to reap the spoils of post-war Europe, for example. So this level of prosperity then that came about was only able to last so long, and then we see what we're talking about here, that in the 70s this thing pops up its head again. And of course, as the economic crisis rears its head again, we see people struggling. The struggles of the 60s and the 70s, they come about. And sadly, I can say, if you look at the conclusion of the majority of those struggles, they ended in defeat. And to me, that is the basis of neoliberalism, right? That when working people stand up for themselves and ask for more, you say, this is not what this system can afford. We are a system in crisis. So we're going to undercut the rights we previously gave you that you struggled for, little by little, in every aspect of struggles of working class and oppressed people in this country, I think you can see this happening. Affirmative action, as little of a gain as it was, is something that's gone, right? The Voting Rights Act. You can think about these things. So I would then say that if the question is then, why has the left supported attempts to politically manage a crisis? It's because the left has given up on what was the credible alternative, which is mass struggles of the working class and oppressed people, and instead has hanging on to what Wayne was talking about, negotiations with the ruling class, primarily through the organ of the Democratic Party. The Democrats have taken this support and used it as cover as they went about themselves implementing neoliberal policies. So I don't think then it's appropriate to say that, you know, Trump is necessarily carrying out neoliberal policies. He will have to. Anyone who's elected will have to keep capitalism alive. But he's a particular reaction to it. I will get to that. Part of what's been able to happen is that the labor movement has suffered historic defeats and has been in retreat. So I think in Britain, for example, you can point to Thatcher's crushing of the miners' strike. In America, you can point to Reagan's crushing of the air traffic controllers in the 80s. And I think it's important to remember that when Reagan ran for president that time, he actively courted the support from the air traffic controllers, and they endorsed him. And when he became president, he shut them down in a way labor has not been shut down ever since. It's like, you know, if you think about revolutions in the Caribbean, for example, when the U.S. invaded Grenada, it sent a clear message that this is what will happen if you rise up. When labor got shut down with the air traffic controllers strike, when PATCO was broken as a union, it sends a clear message, and the Democrats from that day have traded in confrontation for negotiation. The question is, where does it get you? You can think, for example, prior to Obama's election, there was a great movement on the streets around 2006 for immigrants' rights, right? And it was a movement that actually won a victory. It beat back the racist Sensenbrenner bill that would have criminalized undocumented immigrants just for being undocumented immigrants in this country. It would have made them felons. It failed because of that movement. And what was the response? The Democrats came to the leaders of this movement and said, you made your point, that's enough. Today we march, tomorrow we vote, right? And these people threw their support behind Barack Obama. The same president who then deported more undocumented immigrants than any other president in American history. Yet, as the threat of a Trump presidency came around, many liberals on the left, like Sean King, who writes for the New York Post on Black Lives Matter, would tell us, for example, that what we need to do is vote for Hillary, not because she's great, but to stop Trump. And it's a strategy that really makes no sense, never has, and on the other hand, kills struggles. What is needed then is an independent alternative to the Democratic Party. We can walk out this room and it won't be built today, it won't be built tomorrow. But if you're building an alternative and you do not explicitly say that you oppose the Democrats, the likelihood of you being co-opted by the Democrats is very real. Case in point, Black Lives Matter. A great movement. I would call it the new generation of the civil rights movement. But one thing I've never seen Black Lives Matter do is come out principally against the Democratic Party. And lo and behold, on the eve of the election, we see Black Lives Matter leaders like DeRay McKesson endorsing Hillary openly. Alicia Garza, one of the founders of the movement, actually reprimanded him and said, you know, you do not speak for this movement. You cannot endorse Hillary for us. And then she tells people, you know, privately I'm voting for Hillary anyway. And this means you're not taking the responsibility for your position of leadership, because people will follow you. They're going to want an alternative. What to do? Who do I vote for? Do I just sit on my hands? Do I spoil my ballot? Do I stay home? So that's my answer to, you know, the left's attempt to negotiate and basically say that, you know, we can survive this thing. We just got to work together with our friends in power, our friends in labor. The other question as to how can the left struggle for political power with the aim of overcoming capitalism and achieving socialism when the political expression of the crisis of neoliberalism has largely come from the right, I'd like to return to the point about what Trump represents. And one of my political mentors, Cy Landy, from the League for the Revolutionary Party, speaks about populism. And I think to understand Trump and Bernie, you have to understand populism. And one key element of populism Sy talks about is the inability to vanquish who they see as the enemy through grassroots democratic control while maintaining capitalism. As a result, what you look to then is a savior, right? So Occupy Wall Street didn't work on the left. The Tea Party movement didn't work on the right. So you look for a savior in a white horse, what Marxists would call a Bonapartist figure, who supposedly embodies the common good, right? So as Jesus once threw the money changers out the temple, this human replica must then wage war upon these greedy and evil people who are messing up the system. People are failing to understand this role of populism because what they see with neoliberalism is not a crisis of capitalism, but a crisis of neoliberalism itself, where it's a set of policies and ideologies that if we get rid of and return to maybe welfare capitalism, the world will be a better place. But this is a fundamental misunderstanding of Marxism as we know it. If I have time, I'd like to...
You've got 2 minutes.
Okay. So I'd like to end with 2 quick quotes. Marx talks about competition, and he says competition is important to understand because it's the mechanism through which the system realizes its inner laws. But it's not the inner law itself. So that inner law then is this drive for profit and accumulation. Marx says competition executes the inner laws of capital, makes them into compulsory laws towards the individual capital, but it does not invent them, it realizes them. To try to explain them simply as results of competition, therefore means to concede that one does not understand them. And people who oppose neoliberalism by itself without linking it to the capitalist system of exploitation and oppression, they'll be kept in a circle like this. I think a big part of the problem is that the left, as it's known, has retreated from the working class. Like I speak to you openly as someone at a university, but the left has retreated from the shop floor to universities. It has not been able to ground itself in the working class. As the working class has suffered defeat after defeat, the left has just been like, well, we got to find some alternative source of transformational change. And the last quote I'd like to read is from another one of my mentors, C.L.R. James. He's talking here about the role of intellectuals in society, and I think intellectuals are important people. Lenin had said, for example, that a big goal is to create working class intellectuals. James states that the intellectual loves to show the class struggle acting on other people. He hates like hell for it to be applied to himself. There is only one way to overcome this, and that is to accept it. Identify yourself with a fundamental class and go where it goes. Mount it when it mounts and fall with it when it falls. On this basis, you will commit some blunders, but you're always in a position to judge and intellectually command the contending forces of society. You can do this as a person identified with the revolutionary struggle of the working class, or the struggle for the preservation of the bourgeoisie, but once you stand in the middle, looking from one side to the other, all knowledge and intellectual honesty in the world will not save you from futility and folly.
Thank you. So we have a couple of minutes, 3 to 4 minutes for the panelists to respond to one another. I wanted to highlight some of the comments that they said that I think responds to the question, and perhaps some productive differences. Platypus usually thinks that disagreements among the left are potentially productive moments of clarification. We shouldn't sort of, just say that everyone agrees all the time, because clearly there are important disagreements about how to move forward. So, some of the things that were raised was that SYRIZA and these movements aren't capable of grasping the depth of the problem. And so maybe I could ask them, what is the depth of the problem? Is it like Robert has just said, is it sort of a crisis of capitalism itself? And how could the left respond to that in any meaningful way, apart from, as he put it, negotiating versus a confrontation? And one of the things that Michael said was that left seems to be stuck in this kind of historical nostalgia for the 50s and 60s, and how might that be broken? What kind of practices on the left, what kind of conversations on the left would need to happen in order to be broken, or kind of critical reconsideration? And I wanted to ask Wayne, because he said, I'm in the left, but maybe not of the left, and yet you ended your comments calling for a left wing of the movement. So I agree with you. We exist because it's unclear what the left is, but how do you present a unity of principles based on this call for a left wing of the movement? So those are my thoughts out there. We can go in the same order.
Well, I just want to respond to some of the things that each of the speakers said. The truth, I disagree with, frankly. For example, I think that is it Michael? I'm sorry. No. This
Wayne.
Wayne, I think you seriously mischaracterized the nature of the Democrats and the Republican duopoly. The Republicans are not the cutting edge, whereas the Democrats are somehow the softer version. The Democrats are the party of war. They've been behind every major war of the century. And right now they're leading the charge for a war against Russia and for a war for heightened intervention in Syria. So we are dealing with two right-wing parties. And it's really a question as to which is the more right-wing of the two. So I think it's really incorrect to characterize one as somehow sharper or more cutting edge than the other. And also, I'm very surprised to see you engaging in a bit of Russia bashing of your own when you somehow blame Russia for Hillary's defeat, when in fact there is no persuasive evidence that Russia even hacked the DNC. WikiLeaks denies it. The evidence put forth so far is about as impressive as the evidence in favor of Iraqi WMDs in the early aughts. And in fact, when you describe yourself, you couldn't call for a left wing of the resistance. How I can't stand that term. I mean, what you're really calling for is a left wing of the Hillaryite movement, because the resistance is dominated by Hillaryite Democrats. And what's needed is not only a break with the Democrats, but a really ruthless and thorough critique of everything that abysmal party stands for. And moving on to Robert.
Yes.
Or
Michael.
Sorry. I must say, I've really never heard such staggering complacency on a panel of this sort. Nothing has changed. Trump is just Macron. Trump didn't endorse Macron. Trump endorsed Marine Le Pen. And if you can't see Trump as in any way a departure from the norms of post-war American politics, well, then I just really don't know what to say. And finally, Robert. I agree with you completely on the need for an independent party. But I think that you've got to recognize, I'm sure you do, that leftists have been calling for an independent party for literally a century, and it just never happens because of the powerful and deep structural impediments in the way, which prevent the U.S. from even having a kind of a mild West European style social democracy. So yes, we have to call for an independent party, but we can't do so without addressing the structural, legal, constitutional issues that are involved.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. First of all, I agree with the last point about Robert, not Robert. Michael. I'm Wayne.
And that's Wayne, next to him is Michael, and at the end is Robert.
And you were?
Pam.
To say there are no rollbacks, to the extent that's true at all, I would have said yet. The point is there has been a major attack on the working class, and that was my point about Democrats, Republicans, attack on the working class, and to say there haven't been any successes, well, both the example of SYRIZA, the way the crushing of the Greeks, I think the Greeks have it just as good as they had before, the benefits have been massively taken away, or think of the United States, the destruction of the union movement, from a third of the private sector labor force to, what's it now, 6% of the private sector force? And it only probably exists because they can't outsource school teachers. You know, but they're trying with privatization and so forth, with the divorce. So I would say at the most there has been a major attack on the working class, and it has been only so-so in terms of being successful It has won successes, but we kept it from going too far. They will continue, they are continuing, whoever gets elected, whether Democrats or Republicans. Now, it's in that context that I said the Republicans are the cutting edge, and it's absurd to not see the difference between the Republicans' program of quite explicitly wanting to do away with any kind of health care, go back to before the New Deal in terms of benefits, and the Democrats who talk a talk about benefits. The difference between those who say there is no global warming danger and those who say there is, and we should do a little something about it. That's a difference. However, it leads me to the point about when you say there needs to be an alternative to the Democrats, I quite agree. I thoroughly agree, in fact. However, I completely disagree with the majority of the left, the far left, which says let's break with the Democrats and build a new party, a Labor Party, a Green Party, a New Party, or whatever. This still keeps yourself within the limits of electoralism. It still points to the existing state, we'll work through the existing state and make the major changes. That's not going to happen. And not only that, but as a practical thing, the possibilities of building a new party is extremely difficult, more than in the United States than in Europe. Whereas calls for a general strike, calls for more union organizing, calls for mass civil disobedience, calls for militant movement, these things people can understand and accept, even without accepting a full revolutionary socialist program. Whereas it's much more harder to build a Labor Party. To get into that. And which is the point about being the left of the resistance. The point is not to say that we're going to join, let's go to Hillary, etc. The point is that when there's a mass demonstrations, as there were, after the election, we left-wing radicals, including anarchists, participated in those demonstrations, indeed helped to build those demonstrations, but carried our own signs and said our own sayings and tried to build our own perspective, saying openly, we should carry signs, we should make statements that meaning the Democrats are no solution. The Democrats are just as bad or worse in their own way. Go out and say that. But to say, well, I'm not going to participate in those demonstrations, if what one means, I don't know if this is what you mean, Daniel, that by saying we're not going to be part of the resistance means we're not going to join the demonstrations, we're not going to march with them, we're not going to be at the activities, I think that would be completely wrong. If what one means is we're not going to endorse them and vote for their candidates and so forth, that's completely right.
You have a minute.
Okay, I have a minute,
Yeah.
and I'll let that minute go.
Yeah, so taking up the question of whether Trump represents a departure, I would say that the most radical and interesting thing about the Trump administration so far that we've seen is the opening bid in a massive attempt at entitlement rollback, and the ambition to gut Medicaid back down to the point where it was before 1980. And that, of course, is not coming from Trump, who, for all intents and purposes, except on immigration, has no policy views, but it's coming from the Republican majority. So I certainly do see a sort of break in American politics happening through the Obama years, but it's in the radicalization of the Republican Party to the point where it simply can't deliver anything anyone would find desirable, and so is at risk of getting taken over by a fool. So that said, to Pam's question about the sort of the left nostalgia for the 50s and 60s and how we could work our way out of that, I'd first say I'd make a terminological distinction. I think there are three sort of lefts that people talk about. Most people, though not probably most people in this room, say the left and they mean the Democratic Party. So the Democrats are the left and the Republicans are the right. Many people in this room use the left and mean Marxist socialists, or people who reject electoral politics and reject capitalism. To all intents and purposes, that left, I'm on that left, but it doesn't exist. It's a rounding error. There are a few thousand of us. We're all friends with each other on Facebook, but So I want to propose yet a third left. A third left is the constituency that's to the left of the Democrats, takes electoral politics seriously, and sort of identifies as progressive or as centers or as social democrats. Like some people in this room might want to exclude them from the designation left, but there are 15 million of them maybe. They exist as a mass constituency. And the question of can we build a mass party, or how how should we relate to the resistance, is really the question of what historical experience is likely to take those people and radicalize them. It's certainly not the question of they're not left enough so we should ignore them. I mean, that's hopeless because we effectively don't exist and they exist. So the question of the question of how to work our way out of the 50s and 60s, to my mind, when I try to, I'm not proposing this as a program, but when I think about what might help break them out of welfare capitalism land, I think about them getting powerful enough to experience a historical failure, defeat, or betrayal that really shows them the limits of the Democratic Party as it exists, and even the limits of the reformist project.
That means that you want them to fail so they learn?
I'm not proposing a program. I'm trying to imagine a place where they learn. Failure could be demobilizing or it could be educational. I think that might be a place where the non-existent left could intervene productively.
Thank you. Robert?
All right. I don't know if you guys could tell by the color of my shirt or my excitable way of speaking, but I describe myself as a revolutionary socialist, and I started my presentation talking about capitalism to make clear that we need an alternative to the current system we're living in, not the current policies of the system that we're living in. And I think in going about that task, what everybody agrees upon is that we need an organization to complete this task. And there's been a lot of debate about this. Do we need a reformist mass party in the spirit of the British Labour Party and the Canadian NDP? Do we need a vanguard party in the Leninists and the Trotskyist model? Or do something in between? And I think at the end of the day, that's the question you come down to. But I just want to say then, there's steps in between making those decisions, right? And I think one thing is that leadership is important. And if we then widen our horizons beyond America, for example, right? You can't look at the world and say that there isn't a new historical era, that the gains of the past are not being rolled back, if you actually look at places like Greece and Brazil. And then you have to then look at how people are fighting back in those places, like the general strike that was recently had in Brazil. Or the example that's closer to my heart. I'm from Guyana, which is the tiny English-speaking country in South America that's next to two other Guyanas, Suriname, which used to be Dutch Guyana, and French Guyana, or Guyane, which is a colony or a department of France. And in French Guyana, there's an ongoing general strike. How did it come about? In this country of 250,000 people, an organization called the 500 Brothers, who were fed up with the lack of services, the lack of money, the juxtaposition of all this wealth of an international space station there, they were fed up, so they formed an organization and they led a strike. So then if you look at the newspaper of their demonstration a day later, it says on the front of it, 20,000 brothers. Because these people, what they did, they were able to then tap into the feelings of the population, right? So it's going to take somebody to stand up and say, we've had enough of this. You could be a socialist, you could be an anarchist, call yourself a radical, but at the end of the day, you have to then move away from the representatives, the political representatives of the system in which we live in. And you have to call them by their name. That's just my general point. As far as different things that people have said, I think the only thing I really would want to comment on is mostly Wayne's comment about the nihilistic hysteria of the Republican Party in regards to these questions of identity. And I don't think it is hysteria, because I think oppressed people, especially under a Trump administration, feel acutely under attack. I mean, it is a little ridiculous to go to an immigrant neighborhood where people live in fear of ICE raids and tell them that they're experiencing some kind of hysteria. These are real material conditions that you have to respond to. Like, even if you're saying that then the Republican base is seeing it as hysteria.
No, they are hysterical.
Who's hysterical?
The Republican base, the white hysterical.
Right.
Not the black population or the immigrants.
Right, but what I'm trying to say is that this is a function, right? Like the reason these people are being attacked, they're being shuttled, they're being oppressed, is for this very reason, to keep them separated from the white working class. It's not a matter of hysteria so much that, it's a material reality that needs to be there. Like, no idea such as racism or sexism will exist and persist in a society decade after decade and century after century without a material basis. If Trump is turning up the nozzle on this level of oppression, I think the word hysteria shouldn't be in the conversation.
Thank you. So we're going to open it up for Q&A. We take one question at a time, and if you raise your hand and I see it, I will write down some description of you so that I can keep stack. We'll let the panelists answer after each question, unless we're running out of time at the end, in which we might take a couple of questions at the same time. So, any takers?
Okay. So I appreciate very much the different point of view, very interesting. What is striking to me of the origin of neoliberalism, that you were saying 1973, and I'm from Chile, so for me immediately is the coup d'etat in Chile. So for me, neoliberalism was not born in the US, of course ideologically it was born in the US, but it was actually in the material world, was realized in Chile for the first time, and then it was copied all around the world. So in a way, the first Marxist elected through electoral politics, was defeated by, in a way, the imperial forces of the US. So in a way, it is an ideology born from a very conjunctural, a conjunction, right? So this for the first thing. And second is that neoliberals, of course, there's no kind of, I agree with Michael, that there's no kind of new thing of neoliberalism. It's just a consensus among the elites. It's just like democracy, the only game in town. So everybody now abides by neoliberal policies, the left and the right. So they're all right-wing, they're all liberal elites. So there is a consensus among the elites, and there's no other alternative. So the electoral spectrum has, in a way, moved to the right. So the left has been kind of obliterated, and we don't exist. This is the idea. And then is how can this be changed? And at least to my mind is that first you have the electoral route, and of course this is problematic because in a way you need to build a new party, and how do you break this, and how do you mobilize people for a new party if you don't even agree to the agenda of radical politics? It's very difficult. Then you have insurrection, right, and civil war. And you can try that, but we have tried kind of mobilizing, and people go and do Facebook dates or whatever, and they go out and they feel very happy with themselves marching, but then nothing happens, and people go back to being consumers. So I don't see that happening anytime soon. Even if you want to radicalize, it's very difficult to radicalize today. I would say you have to go to a very kind of a point of breakdown. And then is the other alternative that in Latin America has been going around is the populist alternative, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. So that you will elect someone, right, could be from the Democratic Party, it could be like how you see Bernie Sanders is interesting. So could Bernie Sanders have changed the whole thing and we wouldn't be here? Or would be advancing the same neoliberal policies, or maybe these status quo forces would go against him. So in a way, you cannot even electing someone, that person wouldn't be kind of moving back.
I'm asking for your question.
Yeah, so, and the thing is about neoliberalism, what is the connection between neoliberalism and imperialism and war? Because even if we see it in the US context, today we have a transnational elite, and we have, even if we elect like a very progressive person here in the US, is this going to move forward in a way, or is the transnational oligarchy going to, in a way, push back through the financial and military complex that is all around operating?
So the question was mainly about the relations between neoliberalism and war.
And imperialism, yes.
And imperialism. Okay. No, we're going to take one at a time, otherwise the questions get buried. So anyone that would like to answer, not everyone has to.
I agree totally. which is why I object to Michael's description of neoliberalism as libertarian capitalism, because hand in hand with deregulation at home went a military buildup, most especially under Reagan. But you're right to invoke what happened in Chile in 1973, but the whole war drive began under Reagan and then reached fruition under George Bush the first, then the Clintons especially, and then of course things went completely bonkers in the 21st century. So yes, I think that neoliberalism has got to be seen as an adjunct of imperialism, and we're seeing it today in Syria, where the imperialists are bringing all forces to bear in this country, which for various reasons, good and bad, found itself outside this neoliberal consensus. And I don't want to. I'm not an Assadist. I don't want to extol Assad, but nonetheless, he is now under an unprecedented assault, which is equal parts neoliberal and imperialist.
Anyone else?
First of all, reference to the consensus, that may be something that we see it, as we see it, but not necessarily the way the population sees it. Lots of people see the Warren Sanders wing of the Democratic Party as different from the neoliberals, as advocating a classical liberal and therefore with a democratic socialist program. Now, in fact, whatever they think, in fact, under the pressure of capitalism, they will have to carry out a neoliberal program. But it's a mistake to think that there isn't in the public arena by the Democratic Party those advocating something that looks different. When you say that nothing happens when we have these mass marches and so forth, again, I say this is not so. The defeat of the attempts to roll back the healthcare program, at least so far, was due to the mass rising in demonstrations throughout the country. There's a couple of other benefits that have been gained because of the mass struggle, and part of the limitation of the immigration program and so forth. Defeated was largely and partly, at least to a great extent, due to the mass struggles. And that's pretty limited, of course. But I think it's something that they're all taking this into account, the popular opposition. The biggest weakness, as I said before, and the question of what should be done, the biggest thing is the lack of a labor component, the lack of strikes, unionization drives, mass struggle. Without that would provide a source of strength for opposition that does not exist within simply these middle-class mass mobilizations. Unless that happens, there won't be anything. If that happens, it changes the whole framework.
Anyone else? Take more?
I'd just like to respond very quickly.
Yes.
If the question is about then the connection between neoliberalism, capitalism, and imperialism, I would say to the extent that capitalist countries oppress, the imperialized countries, and they're not able to do as well financially, then I think what neoliberalism means there then is that the austerity measures that come along with it are deeper and show up there first. So, it's like if we say, for example, that social protections have not been rolled back in the U.S., well, they've been rolled back in Brazil where they're trying to raise the retirement age to like 70, So like it's going to hit the poorer parts of the world harder and faster. And I think that's just the general thing that's happening now, that people are scared. And like, are we supposedly becoming the third world? Or for the white working class, they're like, are we going to be like everyone else? Because clearly this system doesn't have the profits in it anymore to prop up these gains that they gave to struggling workers anymore. So as they erase them, they will start with those they can more afford to take them away from: the Greek working class, the Portuguese, Spanish, the Brazilian. But our turn will come too.
Thank you. I'm going to take another one.
Okay. I guess, so you brought up and highlighted the issue of nostalgia here, and the kind of desire to perhaps recreate or seize upon energies that seem depleted I guess the thing I kind of wanted to raise is there's a kind of another tendency that I think almost all of our speakers hit at it to some degree, which is a sense of declining productivity, of deceleration, of general malaise, economically and politically, which is in some sense, I think it'd be interesting to talk about how that relates to the sense of a crisis and how these are in some senses two parallel descriptions of what's going on that maybe need to be put into contact. But I just wanted to, I guess, bring up a sense of malaise and a sense of depletion as kind of an aspect of that nostalgia. That this nostalgia is partially, or perhaps can be understood partially, as a response to a feeling that nothing can move forward. Because capitalism has encountered these massive crises of declining rates of profit and inability to properly valorize, you have a general sense of time not passing in which. And any comments on that? Just something I thought about when listening to all of you. Thank you guys so much.
Michael?
Yeah, I think a wonderful book to read about the golden age of capitalism is economic, or just an essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren by Keynes, where he's basically like, in the future, like, we'll only have to work 2 days a week, we'll all live in palaces, like, we'll have to sort of the main problem for us as a society will be to figure out how to avoid boredom, because we have so little to do. And what I want to use that to sort of point to is that the difference between now and 50 years ago is certainly visible in our present, in sort of how we work and what social protections we have, but it's far more visible in our future. The 50s had a or going back to the 30s, I guess there had a sort of wide open future, and now the future seems to close in on people of every political persuasion, and that mood or that sense of hopelessness orients politics in ways that are hard to trace just because it's so ubiquitous.
Michael, can I ask you about the 30s, because you brought it up as a high point of something? Like, what do you mean?
Oh, yeah, I
You're
just
contrasting it with the 50s and 60s.
No, I'm just, I forget the publication date of Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren.
Well, we can do it. Because the historical nostalgia question, right, is why do these images of the left's history come back the way that they do? Any other takers? Yeah?
Unless somebody else wants to go. I just go.
Wayne? Robert?
I'll go.
Yeah?
I think very quickly, I think nostalgia in many ways can relate to whether Trump is a new phenomenon or if he's just part of the establishment with a new face on it. I think it's a bit dangerous to see Trump as part of the establishment, just a continuation. What he is a response to it. This is capitalism trying to save itself. That's what Trump is. The fact that when he's now in power, he's unable to carry out his promises goes to show that neoliberalism then is not just a series of policies or whatever, but the lawful response. And I would even go further to say that if Sanders was elected, he would be forced to implement austerity measures. How else can you keep a system like this alive? If Jill Stein was elected, anti-capitalist program with the Green Party and all, they're not for revolution to achieve this anti-capitalism. Looking at the example of the Greens in Europe, they would have to implement the austerity measures. So what Trump did then, right, and what the Brexit campaigners did, is first they acknowledged that something was wrong. When they said, let's make Britain great again, make America great again, that means something is wrong then, right, if we have to make it great again. So then they appeal to this sense of nostalgia. It's nostalgia for a few things. It's nostalgia for the era where you could be more openly racist and sexist about things, and your locker room video comes out and it's not a problem because, it's just how you treat women or just how you treat people of color. But it's also nostalgia for a time when working people did not necessarily need a college degree to get by in life, and that you could get a job at a factory and achieve the American dream of social mobility. And that's what people are looking around at their lives and losing. So I think in saying, let's make America great again, Trump is fundamentally different from the establishment, because if you look at what Clinton and Obama told people, they said America is already great. I don't know about the lives you guys are living. Mine is not that great. I don't think Trump can make it better, but at least he says, something is broken.
Well, yeah, just, this has come up a couple of times, different points of view. The point about the relation between the malaise and depletion is there's a material basis, which is the way the system works, which is the tendency towards decline and decay and stagnation, underlying stagnation in the period, which is going to continue with ups and downs, so forth. And with certainly a great deal of ups in the virtual, fictitious part of the economy. Some of the rich are doing quite well right now, actually, certainly in terms of paper wealth. But in general, there's a stagnation, and then there's a response to it. And the response takes various forms, which is part of maybe our disagreement before. There's no question in my mind that the white working class population, or they weren't after all the bottom of the working class, upper working white workers and middle class types, have a material basis for their unhappiness. The question, however, they respond in a certain way, and that they can be whipped up in certain ways, and I think there has been to the point of a nihilistic, I use the word hysteria, for a certain wing of those people, which leads into fascism, or can lead into fascism under certain circumstances. We haven't heard that much of that lately. I remember the last time election around, there were people talking about Second Amendment remedies. Talk about, even now, there's talk about the importance of guns and so forth. If the liberals come back in, the black helicopters and all that jazz. That stuff is around. And it's a response. Now, we want to do our best to put a response in a different direction. The very basic, and you're absolutely right, no matter who gets elected, they have the pressure, as long as they keep capitalism, there's a certain limit, there's a pressure they have to keep capitalism, they cannot solve the problem. And therefore, there will be attacks on the working class, even from the nicest guys who mean well.
Back there, Matt, and could you keep your hands raised? I will take some.
Thanks very much for the panel. Thanks very much for the panel conversation. Aside from the gentleman on my far right, your far left, the kind of closing comments that you made, I really appreciated in terms of talking about the rootedness of political parties in particular social bases. I feel like in the broader conversation that was had today, there was sort of a kind of macro painting of the problems that we're dealing with. We're dealing with sort of capitalism on the one hand, on the other hand, we're dealing with sort of national level politics on the other. I think it's really very telling that no one on the panel specifically mentioned any form of municipal politics or state politics or county politics, other forms of organizational investment that might exist outside of either you're in the Democratic Party or you're in some type of syndicalist, anarchist group in Flatbush that knows a bunch of people on Facebook. I take the person on my far left, the far right. I take your comments well in that there are these constitutional legal restrictions on the relationship between progressive visions of political change and electoral politics. But, as we've been talking about the decimation of the working class movement, it seems to me that all that we have left are coalitional politics. We don't sort of have spaces for kind of autonomous social movements to emerge. We have to be building connections and sort of trying to bring people together. So I guess by way of a question is, what types of coalitional politics, aside from sort of making fun of the naivety of the Bernie brothers, like thinking about the golden age of Keynesianism and so on and so forth, what type of concrete coalitional politics can we look forward to as people of a very broad left who want to be able to sort of get involved and be a part of a movement that has probably many different types of voices?
Well, I don't know what coalitional politics really mean. I think it means a coalition involving community groups, democratic politicians, and others of that sort. And yes, I completely oppose that. I think that that you've got to start with the working class, not with a coalition, but with a class. And that class must move, it will move, and when it does move, you'll find politics, the whole political structure will be profoundly shaken. Something that I think is actually you said, there's a false dichotomy here between class struggle, strikes, and general strikes, and that sort of thing, and electoral politics. I mean, bear in mind, the Bolsheviks were campaigning for the Constituent Assembly straight through the revolution, and in fact, even after the revolution. And Lenin saw no distinction between electoral politics and insurrectionary politics. And the purpose of insurrectionary politics was to revolutionize, transform the political structure. And that meant grappling with the political structure.
But that was a coalitional politics.
What was a coalitional politics?
The Bolshevik Revolution was a coalitional politics. I mean, certainly you wouldn't think of that sort of as a singular movement.
Well, we didn't think it was a coalition with the left revolutionaries, but it was primarily the basis of the working class. There were no bourgeois parties that were in that coalition. The bourgeois parties were opposed. So no, so it was a movement that based itself, first and foremost on the working class. So if you go on to Lenin and said, let's make an alliance, a coalition with the cadets, for example, or this liberal group, he would have responded rudely. Now we're in a very difficult spot in the United States. I mean, things are very discouraged. Nothing's moving. The system is frozen. People look at Trump, and yes, they feel nostalgic for Barack Obama, and that's quite understandable on a certain level.
Bush Jr.
Even Bush Jr. I mean, certainly for Barack Obama, but that's understandable. But there is no going back, and I don't see the future as being one of ongoing stagnation. I think this country is facing emergency. I think we're facing a political rupture sooner rather than later. I think that the structure is cracking wide open, and that immense battles are looming. So I think that this kind of tame bourgeois coalition politics really, I don't think have any future.
Does anyone else would like to respond?
So a disorganized left is preferable.
No, an organized left. An
Okay,
organized
we're gonna
working class.
let
A non-existent working class.
It's not non-existent, it's a huge working class.
So I would just counter the point, right? So
Okay, last bit.
That's right.
Yeah, just so we can get everybody else. Last bit.
Sure.
You wanna say?
Let's finish up.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sure. So I would just counter it. So part of a broader unionization movement in the last decade or 15 years, right, has sort of been moving into sectors that have not been traditionally considered part of the working class, and sort of talking about these people, whether they're service workers or graduate students, as workers, right? So expanding the category. Sure. Right? One of the biggest difficulties in doing that has been sort of convincing people or sort of persuading people that you are in fact a worker. Right? Yeah. What you do is for a wage. I'm all in favor of the expansion of that as a form of politics, but when people talk about sort of re-embracing the working class, I don't really know what that means in sort of concrete terms in the absence of a
Class consciousness?
in the absence of a reinvestment in manufacturing in the United States, right? Unless so.
Well, I think the working class can be defined in many ways. Classically, it's the factory workers. But we also use the working class to mean all wage earners, all people, proletarians, and even a guy who or a woman who operates a hot dog stand is in a certain sense a working class, even though one might classify him or her as a petty bourgeois. But the point is that the graduate students. So yes, the proletarianization of graduate students and others of that ilk is great. But yes, we must the working class must move as the working class. I don't have a button I can push and make it magically happen, but I do know that until that happens, we'll get nowhere, and once it happens, it'll be tremors. The movement will be shaken. The political structure will be moved, and so that's the moment we're waiting for. And I think it can happen sooner rather than later.
Okay, maybe 2 responses, and then we move on. So
Yeah.
Michael and Wayne, and then.
Yeah, so my organization, DSA, is pursuing something like a coalitional politics that you described. We're doing strike solidarity, we're helping to organize tenants' unions. We also lack a magic button, so we can't bring about the crisis that will lead to the mobilization of the working class. But we consider that we will be much better placed to exploit's the wrong word, participate and orient that movement, not by awaiting a crisis which will then lead to mass mobilization, but rather by attempting to develop class-conscious working class politics now.
Last night I was at a meeting at the Ethical Culture Society's headquarters. They used their hall, an auditorium with of the group that had organized the March for Climate Jobs, and Justice. There were, I don't know, a couple hundred people there, I suppose, or more. It's hard to couldn't count. The room was completely filled, and they made a point of bringing in people from different angles, different tendencies. There was a whole group of people from construction workers who were, there was somebody on the podium speaking as a Teamster organizer. And part of the argument was for a program of green jobs and retrofitting of buildings and so forth and so on in New York City. And it was specifically said this would be labeled towards good union jobs. And that was part of the program. And that was linked up with questions of struggles of women, struggles of poor people, questions of people of color, and so on. This all gets a $10 word of intersectionality, which is another word for coalitionism and whatnot. Unfortunately, the whole point of this gathering was to have Scott Stringer of the city controller and Trish. James.
James.
Right.
Letitia James.
What's her position?
She's the public.
Public advocate. That's right. Thank you. To come and speak and to hear complaints and programs, and interesting that neither one of them, when specifically asked, would commit to using public funds in New York City and divest from fossil fuels, which is a major demand on them. They said other things that were nice, but this the key area they wouldn't commit to. Anyway, that stuff is there. The problem is not so much that not the coalitionism, because people see that. You've got to be stupid not to see that, the connection between the needs for labor and the fact that the biggest environmental struggle that recently happened in this country was spearheaded by Native Americans. That the Native American issues of their oppression and so forth was directly connected to the ecological threat to humanity. So people can see that. The problem was the liberal electoral program. The problem with local organizing, local government, is that local government is the easiest part of the government to have an impact on, get involved with, and because it has the least power. It has the least impact on actually changing things. So that's all. Let me just mention that the reference to stagnation doesn't mean that I disagree. In fact, I completely agree with the reference to things will get worse, there will be crises, and when you say that there'll be mass upheavals and mass struggles, all I can say is my ancestors would say, from your lips to God's ears.
Okay, I've got 5 people on stack.
So my question is a little different than the previous ones. I'm wondering, so I tend to see critiques of neoliberalism in the mainstream more than I see critiques of capitalism. I'm wondering to what degree you think neoliberalism is actually a useful term or does it obscure the root of the problem, which is capitalism? And just your thoughts on that.
Anyone?
I mean, in preparing for this talk, I kind of dealt with that. So there's this article in The Guardian by George Monbiot, who talks about neoliberalism as the ideology at the root of all of our problems, right? And I think to a certain extent it does, like, I did a word search on this document, for example. I think the word capitalism comes up once or twice. Right? It's really not something that's linked. The problem they see then is that there's not enough regulation of the system as we see it, that the market forces are left to run amok, and there's not enough planning. And I think the counterpoint to that is that if capitalism could be rationally planned, it would have been. You know, like, so many attempts have been made already to rationally plan capitalism, but how do you plan then a system that operates on what, you know, blind economic laws, as they call it? So I do think that, you know, just to answer very directly, the problem is that neoliberalism, to a certain extent, obscures the fact that what we have is a systemic problem as opposed to a problem of this particular era.
Any other takers? No?
Okay. Or unless,
We have 4 other people on the stack, so we can.
okay, never mind.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, this question is, I think, more related to the two that came before, and I was glad to see this brought out in the discussion, which is, it seems to me that much of the what is lacking in contemporary anti-capitalist conversations, if we can say that, is discussions of the need for concrete political programs for working class movements, that people, it seems like part of the mechanism of neoliberalism is to make everyone succumb to a certain kind of rarefied, like, you know, elite leftist academic ghettoites talk about how to endlessly critique and parse things, but the need for a concrete political program that analyzes, you know, key points to attack. You know, for instance, I mean, this may be really old hat, but I mean, this is a very primitive example, I suppose, but, you know, how many people realize that throughout Eastern Europe, communist parties are actually banned by law? You know, communist and socialist parties and various kinds of working class parties are still banned by law in this country. We have Taft-Hartley, among many other things. In the state of Massachusetts, where I'm from, the Communist Party is outlawed. Now, that's not enforced, but if the Boston police does have a red squad. And in other words, there's some just basic, you know, not very sexy, structural problems that can only be met by some kind of organized political force of working class organizations. And it seems like that is, we succumb to the kind of academicization of this by not addressing that head on. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on
Well,
this.
I agree totally. I think that as I said, that the political and economic struggle really must go hand in hand. We've really got to address these political problems as well. I mean, the fact that communist parties are still banned in parts of the U.S. and of course are banned throughout Eastern Europe, and the fact that it is so ferociously hard to organize a third party in this case. The U.S. U.S. legal structure puts impediments before organizing a third party that have been frankly outlawed and declared undemocratic by the EU.
Yes.
But they're routine, they're not even discussed, not debated, not even noticed. So yeah, I think it's very important to address the economic and political aspects of the struggle. There's 2 sides of the same coin. They must go forward hand in hand. We must economize the political and politicize the economic.
Any other takers? Yeah, okay.
Hi, I want to come back to the question of the program, just throwing something out. So I think in the Bernie Sanders campaign, there was a really interesting moment when the primary was already over, and when they were talking about the DNC, the actual convention. And there was a moment when there was a decision made, I think, by Sanders and his camp, to basically throw in their lot with Hillary and support him all out electorally. But before that, there was a very brief moment when they were talking about who's going to be on the program on the platform committee, which is a completely obscure committee that writes some document that no one really reads. So, but there was this moment where you could actually see the possibility of, you know, have like debates about what goes into the program. And at the same time, I think you had a situation where everyone in the country had heard about Bernie Sanders and had an opinion. and everybody in the country would be able to say, would be able to make some simple statement whether they're for or against that. So I think when we talk about building a party, it can't be a party that's far on the left and removed from that. It has to be a party that is programmatically very, very clear and is able to somehow, get traction on that in that regard.
Getting traction is really
Yeah. I mean, not only in a general sense, but sort of leverage that moment, or similar moments like that. And then also, of course, why was that a failure in the Sanders campaign? I guess they weren't set up for that.
Anyone else want to
Yeah.
Yeah, so they put some people from the Sanders campaign onto this program committee, and they passed some rules, and weren't allowed to. They passed some planks, and they didn't pass some other planks. And there's a famous line that I'm sure you've heard about the similarity between the platform of a political party and the platform of a train station. That either way, the things you leave behind. It didn't make any difference. It wasn't going to make any difference. It was part of the fraudulence of the whole activity. It was throwing a bone to Sanders, who could then say, "Oh, we passed this very progressive platform." Didn't mean shit. Even if they had gotten elected, Hillary was not going to implement this platform. Wasn't even going to look at this platform. And to use that as a justification is, I think, is being naive. I think what is valid, I think a major point that was made before was the point made here about how extremely difficult it is in the United States, more so than any of the European countries, to get on the ballot, to build a third party, a Green Party or any other party. Other countries have proportional representation, so you get 5% of the vote, then you get 5% of the parliament, or they have these second rounds, so you don't feel like people don't feel like they wasted their vote the first time on a small left party. None of those things. New York State, for example, is the only state in the country, I think, where the Working Families Party can do things like endorse a Democrats and still run. Cross endorsement is not allowed in the rest of the country. It's almost impossible, as a simple practical matter. The idea of putting the left, minuscule as it is, or non-existent as it is, putting its energy, its human resources, and its money into trying to build a new party is, and electoral action in general, is a great deal, I think, is extremely a waste of time as compared to trying to build that independent mass movement that rejects all political parties.
Michael?
Yeah, just to speak to that, so I mostly agree that in the current context it's very tough to build a third party for ballot rule reasons. And I think it's equally clear that what Sanders did, which is run in a Democratic primary with a clear populist program that he repeated at every train stop, and and talk about free healthcare and free college. Free college wouldn't have been my pick. I might have said free child care, but or a child allowance or that sort of thing. But a simple blunt platform that mobilizes people and a Democratic primary road. Whatever you think of that, it is the thing that I think unquestionably has worked better than anything the left has tried in my lifetime. So that's a very high bar to beat. I vehemently disagreed with you when you said that it might be easier to call a general strike than to pursue an electoral strategy. I think we're at 6% union density, well short of that. But I think
That's my point.
Yeah, sure. But I think on the municipal level, the Sanders effort was not without remainder because the New York single payer is now one vote short of passing the New York State Senate. So he raised awareness on that issue. It wasn't just a Democratic platform thing. This is something that is dramatically closer to passing because of what he did.
Oh, okay. I have a few questions. One of them is, I'm just wondering, if when you talk about the, kind of maybe the liberal bourgeoisie nature of social movements, I was wondering if you see also one problem being in the last many years now is that there is domination the revolution will not happen in the nonprofit industrial complex. Or it will not be funded. So that's one question, the role of what you see as the role of the domination of the nonprofits dominating the social movements. The other thing is, you talk about the working class, from this big role of the working class, and then we also have this large people who are discouraged, looking for jobs, people with large unemployed population, large poor, disabled, and senior population. So what is the role of some social movements of unemployed people? And the other thing is, my third question is about the criticism by Black Lives Matter of, you talk a lot about the Bernie campaign of kind of this focusing on class, not willing to talk about Black Lives Matter. It took a push from a lot of confrontational actions from Black Lives Matter to push Bernie to talk about Black Lives Matter and to discuss white supremacy. He kept saying it's all taken care of in class, and that sometimes still takes place in social movements to some extent. It's all going to be taken care of by class. So those are three questions.
Maybe if you're going to respond to that, answer the question of what is class. That's usually confusion.
So three questions about race, issue of race, the unemployed, and not the nonprofit industrial complex and social movements.
Any takers? Yes.
Well, just to start off with the question of class and Bernie's response to Black Lives Matter, I would just say, in a general sense, the working class in this country are the majority of people who, sell their labor to stay alive.
Right.
The general American sense of it is that, you have to be poor to be part of the working class. And like a lot of upper working class people who are like in unionized jobs, like transit workers, who, like the ones who drive the trains, by the time they retire, they could retire close to $100,000 a year. But they're nonetheless part of the working class. But this whole thing then that, we can focus on economism and just economic issues, and somehow it will then, and this was Barack Obama's idea, like when he was challenged to specifically address Black issues, he'd say things like, well, I'm going to address issues of poverty and that will help. But the truth is, a rising tide does not lift all ships, does not lift all boats, right? Because people of color, women, other oppressed people, we weighed down by this extra thing.
Yeah, right.
So I think that, for me, like when someone says, the Democratic Party primaries is an active route we can take to making the world a better place, I ask how. Because the last time I checked, until Black Lives Matter confronted him, Bernie had nothing to say in there about all the Black people being murdered in the country.
Right.
Any other takers?
But again, with the answer of what is the role of unemployed people in the social movement?
I'll let someone else speak.
The purpose of a working class, a revolutionary class, is the tribune of the people that leads society as a whole on the path to change. So yes, the working class would want to draw, into it, pensioners, unemployed, others, like that, rights and want them addressed. But the focus of the movement is still on the class itself. On the question of poverty versus race, if there was ever a serious effort to deal with poverty in this country, that would be amazing. Of course, there isn't. But if there was ever an effort to deal with that, people would be jumping up and down in joy. But you really can't address poverty without addressing race, and can't address race without addressing poverty. And they really aren't separate categories. Class and race are really closely intermingled. And that's what the more ones left.
Any other takers? I've got myself down in the stack of minutes. I've got Allison. Anyone else? Oh, I'm sorry. Gabe was before I was. Go ahead.
Oh, great. So, Daniel mentioned the looming crisis, and I wanted to ask you, what time frame did you have in mind?
3:15 in the afternoon.
So, were you saying the same thing in a different way, or in the same way 10 years ago, 20 years ago? 30 years ago? In what way is it different now? What is it? And then to Michael, who says that, you know, we don't have a magic button. Is it the case, perhaps, that it's not the material crisis that's missing, but rather that crisis would need to be constituted politically, and which would then lead us to the question of political leadership to constitute a crisis? So, and back to Dan. So, Michael, also, if you could respond, and any panelists to respond to that. But back to Daniel, what shape do you see this like emergent class politics taking post a crisis? When you talk about that, it might seem plausible that a new class politics would speak to working class concerns would be a new right-wing politics. And so, what do you think about that? And that's
well, I mean, I think any right-wing politics would be a demagogic attempt to appropriate working class anger and steer it in some kind of reactionary direction. When I say the battles are looming, I can't say it'll be here by tomorrow morning. But I think that there's been a definite acceleration, intensification of the crisis. Actually, it's a word I used in my first talk here. I mean, 20 years ago, the feeling was of unbearable lassitude, of just drift, of just like Clintonism, just the same old Washington. And then since 2001, sort of, there's been a dramatic escalation since 2008, and now since Trump's election, where I think the constitutional structure is really bursting wide open. Trump may be impeached. Strange things are happening. The CIA and the FBI are mobilizing behind the scenes. I think that there's some kind of war drive going on. I think things are really spinning out of control. And it's like Humpty Dumpty. Once they spin out of control, you really can't, re-achieve normalcy, the old equilibrium. Because once the old equilibrium shatters, it stays shattered. And as to what form working class politics would take, I mean, I think one interesting thing, in contrast to the 30s, is the 30s saw some immense class battles. San Francisco, Minneapolis, Toledo. But those battles, as immense as they were, never advanced beyond purely economic. They never became political. But I think that if we see anything comparable here in the United States today, it'll be politicized from the start. It'll be anti-Trump. It'll be challenging the political structure at the very beginning. And I think that any kind of eruption of class war, which I think has got to happen sooner, eventually, because the American workers can't keep on taking this. I think that it'll take a political form as well, which it will have to just challenge head-on the undemocratic nature of the American political structure, the fossilized 18th century quality of Washington. The fact that we have a Senate which is more powerful than the House, which grants equal representation to a Wyoming, that's a minority majority giant like California. No other country in the world has this. So yeah, so if workers take to the streets, I would think that I would hope that that abolition or reform of the Senate, doing it at the Electoral College, a constituent assembly, not a constitutional convention, but a constituent assembly such as the one that Mélenchon called for in France, would be a revolutionary demand for the people to be elected on one person, one vote, to completely restructure American government from the top to the bottom, casting aside all this 18th century apparatus and redesigning the American democracy from the start. Trotsky called for something like that in France in 1934. Lenin supported a constituent assembly until he didn't. And Mélenchon called for a constituent assembly as well in France. So I think that the system is cracking wide open. I'm very glad to say. I don't know what great battles are looming, and those battles will be simultaneously economic and political.
Any other takers?
Just that when you think back to the last two periods of radicalization, of the 30s, which was predominantly economic, or the radicalization of the 60s, which seemed to be, was focused first on the winning the fight against racism, in the U.S. South particularly, and then fighting against the war, and then had a whole very strong cultural aspect that affected all sorts of issues, including women's rights, gay rights, and so forth. I'm pretty sure that the next upheaval that we're just beginning working our way into now, will be sort of like a combination of the 30s and the 60s, which had both kinds of issues to be together. That there has to be the economic issues, given we don't have the level of prosperity that we had at the end of the 60s, and on the other hand, there has to be all sorts of cultural, political, and social issues that didn't come to the front, partly because we have the advantage of not having a Communist Party. That the possibility of a left, that along with the disadvantages of not having a left, we have the advantages of starting again without the whole Stalinist, and I would also say Leninist, overhang that held things back in the past. So I expect to see a very mixed and very exciting future, in spite of the fact that it's taking us much longer than I would like to see.
Any other questions? No? Okay, I wanted to ask a question. So during the Platypus reading group, one of the things that we read is by Cliff Slaughter, Crisis of Revolutionary Leadership, in which he argues that organization, which Robert brought up, right, the organization meaning, do we have a mass party, do we have a vanguard party? Another example would be, do we have an international, like in the 19th century? It's not the same as a mass party or a political vanguard party. So Cliff Slaughter says that organization is a form of historical memory. It's a kind of historical memory of attempts at confrontation. So you learn by attempting to change the world. And part of that learning is embodied in an organization. And so Dan just brought up the Constituent Assembly, but one of the things that was raised, I think, by Matt in the back in his first question, and by others, is the need for a working class to constitute itself as such, as a class. So while objectively we can say there exist wage earners, how could we get laborers to consider themselves to be part of a working class? If you ask most people in America, do you consider yourself part of a working class? You know, they think they're sort of in the waiting room to become middle class people, or, you know, that soon they could achieve some way out of labor. So if the left has any interest in founding itself within the working class, what kind of organizations would we need to build in order to develop this class consciousness that everyone keeps on sort of assuming is necessary?
Well, I mean, a political party, unlike a labor union or some kind of coalition, is a three-dimensional organization. I mean, it deals with the full range of politics and economics. It's kind of like a university, maybe even a bit of a church, a fellowship, etc. But its intellectual, ideological scope is wide open, and it considers everything under the sun in the process of trying to create a coherent class viewpoint. So I think that, I believe that a political party is an essential part of the process of creation of a class-conscious working class. But I think that the middle-class consciousness that's been imposed on the American working class is the result of an absence of any kind of working class party, number one. Number two, a sclerotic, frozen, increasingly undemocratic political structure, which essentially just makes any kind of political self-expression, it scrambles politics, makes any kind of coherent politics all but impossible. And so people feel themselves to be middle class, but they don't really think about what that means. They can't think about it individually, they don't really think about it in the context of a political party or working class politics. So I think that somehow breaking through this carapace is the key to any kind of rejuvenation of the left. And as to when that occurs, I don't know, but I think things are cracking wide open. The bad news is they're cracking wide open. The good news is they're cracking wide open. So I think the crises and also opportunities will move the coming period.
I think identities and class consciousness, let's say, emerges from organizing around a demand. I think you can see this in grad student unionization movement that people who start off being like, okay, maybe I'll get dental insurance finally, sort of once they draw the line and demand dental insurance and see the administrators and professors line up in opposition to them, develop a new sense of a new and more adequate, more accurate sense of their place in society than they might have had before. So maybe you could think of it as replacing identity with consciousness. I think I really can't think of a form of institution that is better suited for producing class consciousness than a rank and file democratic union. The only thing marginally comparable might be tenants unions, because they produce the same kind of realization of like people who are like, oh, I'm like paying for the privilege of living here, thank you, landlord, sort of organize around a demand, and then they're like, yeah, like who the fuck are you? Like, to ask rent for me, I live here, I have to do my own repairs, like, screw you. And that sort of, that draws a line for them in a productive way. I really don't think that there are many forms of organization that are capable of doing that besides labor unions. So the question of restarting the American labor movement, conceivably even outside of the New Deal settlement on labor law, is to me a very primary one. If you do coalition politics, then you can team up with workers' centers, which are trying to think through some of those problems.
All right. First of all, I agree that the importance of unions, although it means we're going to have to fight, requires a fight against the union bureaucracy, even the most liberal union bureaucracy, because they've made their peace, and they're working inside the system, and there's an inevitable conservatism and bureaucratization that goes on. But that's one of the key areas, the drive for unionization that have to happen. But it's not going to be just like, the usual one union at a time. At a certain point, there's going to be like a mass movement, I think. Unionization will be like whole cities will be, up in arms. The idea of a general strike won't be as quite bizarre as it might seem right now to some of us. So I agree on this point. On the other hand, the point about political parties, certainly in terms about a radical political party, let me just say that the United States, North America, is a very big place, and it has many different situations, and the idea that there would be one radical party that would have all the best militants and all the best ideas, it seems to be very unlikely. And I would expect that an actual revolution would take place, would have some kind of coalitions between different groups. And in fact, the point of the Russian Revolution, I think some of us making before, the actual revolution was made not just by the Bolsheviks, but by the coalition. In fact, the Bolsheviks, the left SRs, social revolutionaries, and a wide range of anarchists. And it was eventually, and the first Bolshevik government was a coalition between the communists, the Leninists, and the left social revolutionaries with support in the Soviets by anarchists. And it was the breaking of that coalition and the evolution towards a one-party state that was a major step on the road toward eventual totalitarianism, I would argue. So I think there will be political parties, in the sense of radical revolutionary groups, but I don't think there's going to be one party that's going to have everybody level the solutions.
Well, if the question is, why don't American workers consider themselves American as workers, and how do we get there? And I think if you look at how we came to be here, a big part of it is the peculiar historical development of the United States, the major feature of which was African slavery, right? That people were bound to the plantations. This is why Marx lamented that labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin or in the black skin that is branded. And throughout American history, this has been a thing that's held back the class struggle in a way that, let's say, the French or the German working class has not had to deal with. So in the French and the German working class, they have things like mass workers' parties, not necessarily revolutionary parties, but in France, for example, the last president was a socialist. We don't really have that here in the U.S. So I think part of overcoming, yeah.
Just for the audience, we don't have a socialist.
I'm not a revolutionary socialist. A man who calls himself a socialist. But I think then the point is that
No, I meant Debs. I'm sorry, not Bernie Sanders. We had a socialist party at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying then that if this is a result of the peculiar historical development of America, I don't think there are any then shortcuts politically or organizationally to fixing it, that people have to get this sense of themselves as a class through their own experiences in struggle. So then how do you get people to struggle? I'm not necessarily of the point of view that, you need to take like some kind of rod and poke people and go struggle. I believe in the concept of the self-activity of the working class. That, when pushed too far, people will fight back eventually. This is why I think then, when Trotsky says, for example, that you can reduce the question of the revolutionary crisis to one of leadership, it makes a lot of sense, because when people struggle, how do those struggles get derailed? It is by leaders who say, today we march, tomorrow we vote. So this is why I don't get down with the idea of the Democratic Party, because at the end of the day, they derail struggles into electoral platforms. That isn't to say that as a socialist, if an opportunity comes along for you to run in elections, you should disavow it. But you're not doing it with this idea that if I win, I'm going to transform society somehow. You're doing it as a way to then project your ideas and win people to your perspective. I mean, what it will take then, right? So yes, we do need labor unions, but the leaders of the labor unions that are putting the brakes on the struggle are not challenged about that, where will the labor unions go? In New York City and New York State, we have this thing called the Taylor Law, right? I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Taylor Law, but the Taylor Law makes it illegal for public sector workers to go on strike. And it's what holds back this city's working class more than anything else. And we have a union density here that's not really repeated much else in the rest of the world. But because of this coalition of the labor leaders with the Democrats, we don't struggle. And you can see, if you look back at the 2005 transit strike, working class people in this city have an immense amount of power. This city was shut down when the transit workers went on strike. Now, the transit workers went on strike in regards to their contract and everything, but just imagine that the next person the NYPD shoots, the transit workers go on strike. And I think that's where the two things come together, but you can't have them come together unless you, as a socialist, as a radical, you're part of these organizations, like the unions, fighting for leadership within them, to tell people that, that you think, for example, that Samuelson, who's the leader of the Transport Workers Union, can take our struggle forward. I don't believe you. And you say, I'm coming from this perspective as an open and revolutionary socialist, because Samuelson and the Democrats he partners with want to maintain the system of capitalism that we're under. You have to be very clear about these things. And you might win people in the ones and twos, and I would say that if you are trying to build, for example, a vanguard party, that is your goal. But people will then come to your position only through, I would say, their own experiences of struggle. But in a country where we've never even had something like a nationwide general strike, it's not going to be, like the comrade was saying, something where you just push a button and it happens. It's like long, slow, patient work. I mean, I would say the organization I used to be part of, the League for the Revolutionary Party, for all their problems, they're one of the only groups of people in the country that does work in a union openly as communists. And that is hard to do. It's easier to do it on a campus setting. There are more young people to attract, like people don't have to go home to their families after a long slog. But if you do really want to make that change, you have to hang your hat on the working class, and you have to fight for leadership within its organizations.
So something that's come up a lot, and I think rightly so, is the non-existence or dead character of the left today, and also the structural major obstacles to building a working class party.
But I kind of wanted to bring this back to a historical perspective, because obviously there was a point in history when the left was quite powerful. And considering the failure of that left and how that haunts us today. So like, was the retreat or failure of the left even maybe to blame for our present condition? And how might we move beyond that?
Are you referring to the SB?
Sorry?
Are you referring to the SB?
I mean, I'm thinking of 1923 and the failed German Revolution, and the retreat of the left as a force in history since then.
In Germany. I mean, in the United States, I mean, the Socialist Party was a very big party, but it was unfortunately very low quality. Didn't put out a single paper. Debs made it a point of never even attending national conventions. It was like it really was a coalition in the worst sense of wobblies, of trade unionists, craft unionists, preachers, very, very important. And it had, by the way, an explicitly racist component, explicitly shocking. It was actually one of the most popular SP pamphlets, denounced racial integration as a plot by the bosses to degrade white workers, and actually said like, how terrible if white workers are forced to drink from the same water bucket as black workers. This is a very, very popular pamphlet. Tens of thousands of copies were printed. And the SP kind of sort of disintegrated of its own, and the Communist Party had certain problems. In Germany, the events in 1919 kind of fell apart because the movement was very immature, and one could perhaps criticize Rosa Luxemburg for not breaking with the SDP earlier. But then by 1923, you got caught up in common-turn politics, which were changing very rapidly. But yeah, those failures had repercussions, and yes, we're living with those repercussions to this day.
I mean, that is the problem, right? Like, people talk about the left, but what is the left? Like, we would say, for example, it's a coalition of labor and groups that represent, like, oppressed minorities fighting for their rights. But for the most part, as, like, the comrades were saying with the Socialist Party, not only did they have racism, you can read letters from Lenin where he's raging, you cannot support immigration quotas and be a Socialist Party. So, if you then say, there was a failure of the left, like, who are you talking about? Are you talking about the Socialist parties? Are you talking about the labor unions? Are you talking about the women's rights movement? Are you talking about the struggle for black rights? Like, I don't think there's really a common thread running through these things. Certainly, they didn't work together, right? Like, I was speaking before about this, like, the disfigurement, I call it, of American social movements that's been imprinted on it by slavery. Like, why, for example, were the leaders of the suffragette movement, who previously were abolitionists, turning around and advocating anti-black racism in their fight for the vote? Like, these are like historical things that the American left has never really overcome, like these deep, deep divisions in the working class. Like, even the concept of identity politics, right? Like, the first place it's ever shown up is in the Combahee River Collective, which is a collective of radical feminist black lesbians. And they're saying, we're coming out with this concept of identity politics because our experience has been left behind. They're fighting against this kind of class reductionism. So, like, even then in the 70s, they had this problem where there isn't this real unity of the left, and every oppressed group, they see themselves, not as part of, a general working class, but under this umbrella of oppression. And as capitalism blows down upon us, then everybody's trying to jostle to find the best space and the most protection from it. And I think a big part of that has to do with then this concept of the working class. Not to say that you forget about identities, but then I think what needs to happen is that you need to centralize the working class. So I would say, for example, in the struggle for black liberation, the black working class, which is the majority of black people anyway, plays a key role. You know, like if you look at the Russian Revolution, it's the women workers who, you know, put themselves out there to begin that revolution in February. And I don't think it...
By breaking with the feminists.
Yes, by breaking with the feminists. The fact that people who are in support of women's liberation today openly call themselves feminists just goes to show that there's a real disconnect between the movements of the past and today. Because if you read like a Russian revolutionary like Kollontai, she's basically excoriating these people who call themselves feminists. Why? Because they see the enemy as men, whereas she's saying that, well, my allies are working class men. So like, there's a lot that you have to like dig through and come back to answer these questions of the failure of the left.
Michael?
Yeah, so absolutely the failures of the left are in part responsible for our situation today, but I would add that so too are the tremendous successes of the left in the first half of the 20th century, who managed in the industrial core countries at least to transform capitalism very deeply, to build the welfare state and sort of active management of the economy and make the system dramatically less crisis prone and dramatically less likely to suddenly start to starve millions of people to death. That success, which was, you know, like one on the sort of implicit threat or explicit threat of violent revolution, has deeply changed the terrain on which we fight. We fight a very different, in a very different circumstance against the same enemy. And in particular, I would say that the capitalism we see today is significantly less prone to acute crises, and that provides perhaps fewer opportunities for us.
2008 was not an acute crisis?
Less prone.
What? 2008 was the greatest financial crisis the world has ever seen. What are you saying? That capitalism is less prone to crisis now than it was previously? It's more prone to crisis. The crises have been pushed off, but now they're bunching up. So we're seeing an intense. We're moving to a period of crisis.
Are you sure the Great Depression was a smaller crisis than 2008?
By any standard, the 2008 as compared to 29 or 37 was a much bigger crisis. It was happened simultaneously on the globe, instantaneously, thanks to the internet and other communications. I mean, by any measure, it was the greatest financial crisis the capitalist world has ever seen. Mm-hmm. Now it was contained, it was bottled up, but only at the cost of pushing the crisis down the road.
In the can down the road.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, I completely agree with Daniel on this point. To speak as though the post-World War II boom, the so-called golden age of capitalism, is a standard that, you know, to go back and the people, then they thought the liberals and sort of Democrats thought they had solved the problems of capitalism because the pressure of the masses and so forth. That's over. That prosperity, that temporary for the industrialized world, the imperialist world, and especially for white people, but that's over. That's going. Now, that doesn't mean that tomorrow everything, you know, collapses. It does mean that there will be a movement downhill, and at some point everything will collapse. And it's something that we were not faced with in the 30s, which is not two things. We are now faced with the danger of nuclear war, and we are faced with the ongoing threat of climate destruction, of ecological catastrophe, which includes, not limited to, the destruction of the climate, which will destroy civilization. Not in 1,000 years, but in decades, from now. It may already be too late. To speak of a lack of crisis is really missing the point. In fact, that's exactly what causes revolutions. The fact that there is a fundamental crisis and yet consciousness about it is so far away. If people were rational and sensitive and so forth and not, you know, brainwashed by the system, they would rationally say, well, let's see, these are the problems, let's fix it and so forth. but they don't until it's almost too late. And that's when you have an upheaval and so forth. So I think that the possibility of a crisis and mass upheavals are coming. And I'm only hoping that the mass upheavals will come in time.
And be from the left?
They will be both from the right and the left. That's what we're seeing now. We're seeing the whittling away in the center. And not enough of the left. Certainly there's been a growth of the right, and to get to the point where there's almost, the middle is vanishing, and the people who say, well, let's not fight off the far right, let's fight off the Bannons and the Trumps by going to Hillary, are missing the point entirely. That the center point will not save us any more than voting for Hindenburg saved the German people from Hitler.
I just wanted to let our audience know there have been some references here of the 1930s, the 1960s, the Second International Radicals of the 19th century. We in Platypus think that we can start talking about the left as a historical tradition and of aspiration for confronting the world as such. And if you'd like to learn more about what these moments meant on the left, we'd welcome you to come to our writing group that happens on Mondays here at NYU. You can find out more on our website. You can take some more pamphlets outside, and we're with pins. Anyone, you can come talk to us. I'd like to give a big round of applause to our panelists tonight.